Okay, in terms of stuff, deadlines are unchangified, so exam 1, covering part 1, quiz and assignments part 2, covering part 2, deadline on March 1st, exam 2, quiz and assignments part 2, one class. And exam 2, quiz and assignments part 3, April 5th. Exam 3, exam 4, quiz and assignments part 4, April 26th. All are end of day. Upcoming meetings, today 2 to 5, tomorrow 11 to 5, 2 to 20, provost thing 10 to 1:15, and then 2 to 3. And I don't think I'll be able to get back in office hours long enough to be there because I have to walk them. So, but I'll be over in the Grand Ballroom this time. Then March 6th, 12 to 2, and then April, the first Wednesday then, and I'm on 3 other committees which haven't been assigned yet, so again, I'll let you know when those meet. Okay, so that's the stuff. Before going on to our new stuff, any stuff about stuff that's been, or stuff that shall be, that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we were looking at the dreaded rhetorical analogy and misleading comparisons. And we saw essentially the technique is pretty useful. What you do is you want to make something feel good or feel bad, so you draw an analogy or comparison to something that your target audience hopefully accepts as good or bad. And we saw a variety of techniques. You can compare people to people to make them look good or bad. So Republicans all used to want to be like Ronald Reagan, Democrats like Kennedy, no one except Nazis want to be like Hitler, and so typically for most people a Hitler comparison is negative. We also saw you can compare people to animals, either to praise or to insult, and you can compare things to things, like an idea to a really bad idea, like the classic inflatable dartboard. And we'll see in the future arguments by analogy as well as explanations using analogies. Then we headed to misleading comparisons. As we go through life, of course, we do a lot of comparison shopping. Literally, in some cases, like if you go to the store and you're looking at 2 boxes of cereal to get super sugar bombs or super sugar bombs, or whatever type of cereal you're getting, and you look at them to see which one to buy. Or you're picking between multiple phones, or picking majors, picking between houses, or more abstractly comparing data about occurrences of things. And the short and long of it is we compare a lot of stuff to make choices. Now ideally, of course, you want to make good choices. So you want to know when you're making a comparison, how do you make a good comparison? Now what the best choice is will depend a lot on your values, because people have different values, different things they want or dislike. And so a good choice for one person, in terms of like the phone they pick, the major they pick, the person they marry, could be a terrible choice for someone else. So one person's good choice is another person's bad choice. But we won't go into like good choice, bad choice for values, because we'll just look at the comparisons. Now, when you get a comparison, one critical question to ask, even if it matters, is this. Is there important information being left out of the comparison? And last time I believe I gave the example, if someone's looking for a babysitter and they see that, say, 10% of cases of child abuse involve alcoholics, they might think, wow, that means 90% involve people who aren't. So it may seem, just looking at those numbers out of context, that you'd want to get someone who's an alcoholic to be a babysitter because it seems to be less likely. But of course that seems counterintuitive. So what you need to know is some important information. Namely, what is the percentage of people who are alcoholics? So if it's, say, 3%, that means that rather than being low, it's rather high. In other words, they're abusing it like 3.333 times their numbers. So whenever you see a comparison talking about like, 10% of crimes are committed by these people, or 23% of Nobel Prizes are won by those people. You'd want to know like the percentage of the population, because it may be, you know, a very misleading sort of comparison. So question one is, if it matters, you'd want to ask, is there important information missing? Another example, it can be pretty easy to scare people with seemingly large numbers by leaving out important information. For example, suppose you hear on the news that deaths caused by cocaine among 90-year-olds has increased 100%. Do we have a elderly cocaine epidemic on our hands? If we hear that in the news? No, maybe, maybe not. Because in order to know if 100% increase is really significant or not, because it sounds big, but in order to know if it's actually big, we'd have to know what? Yeah, how many people? Because if there was, say, like, one death, you know, from cocaine use, bad, sad, tragic, but of course 100% increase there would be 2 people. Still, you know, bad and sad and tragic, but it would be no grounds for panic. So you can have seemingly massive increases. I mean, we can make it like 300%. And if you start off with a relatively small starting number, a large percentage increase will seem kind of scary, or good, depending on what you're talking about. But unless you know the base starting point, it doesn't tell you that much. I mean, true, it tells you it's increased, but you don't know if you've got an epidemic on your hands or not. So when people throw out figures, often to make something look, you know, really scary, or maybe to make something look good. So, for example, if an author says their profits were up 500%, and they went from like $1 to $5, well, yeah, it's increased dramatically, but that's really they're not making big money. So again, question one is, if you get a comparison between things, then you'd want to ask, if it matters, is there important information being left out? Because it can create a very different picture. Question two. Are the same standards being used when comparing things? Also, are the same recording and reporting practices being used? Now this is important because without the same standard, without the same means of recording and reporting, you can see a increase or decrease that's really not there. For example, one thing that people who are older often point to is they'll talk about like how cheap things used to be when they were young, how expensive things are today. And my parents, you know, told that to me. Of course, usually when I asked for money, they would say, things were so cheap back then. And I'll, you know, use an example to illustrate this. Back in the ancient days when I was a kid, after church, you know, my mother would give me $1, and I could go to the local drugstore, not to buy drugs, of course, because it's the only thing open on Sundays, but I could buy 4 comics, or 3 comics and a candy bar, or 4 candy bars, or some combination. And of course today, if you go to like a store with $1, you might be able to buy 1 candy bar, maybe, but probably not. You certainly can't buy comics. I haven't priced them in a long time, but I'm guessing they're probably like $3 or $4. And so, similarly like with gas, if you hear people talking about, I remember when gas was 50 cents. And of course my mother used to say she'd go to the movie, you know, her mother would give her like a $quarter and that would pay for the movie, pay for the popcorn, etc. Or when people talk about housing prices. Years ago when my parents bought their house, I think it was like $9,000. Of course it was in Old Town, Maine, but still $9,000. And so we think back in the past, things were super cheap. Or a final example. When I first started working and learning the joys of minimum wage, it was $3.25. So I'd spend an hour mowing someone's lawn, and they would give me $3.25. Now, today, of course, the minimum wage is what? Yes, yeah, $8.25. So today we might think, comparing them, you know, we can use minimum wages as kind of our illustration. So back in those, long ancient days ago when I was pushing a lawnmower around for money, I'd get $3.25 for an hour's work. Today people get $8.25. Now just based on the numbers, does it look like people are much better paid today? Yeah, because, this is $5 more per hour. But is that really the case? Are people really paid more for minimum wage today? On the hand, yeah, because, number-wise, $8.25 is bigger than $3.25. But of course, the weird thing about money, many weird things about it is, you can't compare today's dollars to past dollars. Why not? Well, if we go back into the 1980s, terrifying place. How much could $3.25 buy in 1980? Yeah, surprisingly, quite a bit. So, for example, I remember I was nerd, of course, in high school, and I'd buy games like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And if I did like 3 lawns, I could buy like a full game, for like $10. And I measure everything in that because nerd. But today, of course, if you try to buy like a similar thing today, it would be about 40 to 50. And so back then, yeah, I was making less, I was handed less, paper, same coin, but I could buy way more than one could buy today. Some if you compare like the cost of, food, like groceries and Big Macs, etc. So even though I was making $3.25 an hour back then, which again, if someone says, hey, minimum wage has gone way up, it's $8.25 an hour, way better. If someone's working minimum wage today, they're actually making less money than me. I mean, they're making more, bills than me, but they can buy less stuff. And the reason is, of course, the demon of inflation. Because every year when you have inflation, your money is worth less and less. So every year you're not getting a raise, you're effectively getting a salary decrease because your money buys less and less stuff, for the most part. And so if we're talking about, when people today say there's no reason to raise the minimum wage, and people make this argument. I've heard, senators and Congress folks and governors say, back when I was a kid, I was mowing lawns at $3.25 an hour. Today it's $8.25 or $15 or whatever. They're making way more money. But it's not a fair comparison because you have to look at what $3.25 could buy then and what $8.25 buys now. It's actually less. Same with like comparing, housing prices, etc. Another example using money. One of my friends kind of obsessed about box office, stuff for some reason, and he's always careful to point out that when you compare box office receipts for films, if you're comparing like now to then, you have to take into account the money thing, because again, way back then tickets were like a couple bucks, and today if you go to like an IMAX 3D, you're paying how much? Yeah, $20. So yeah, I mean, if the movies are way more expensive, then of course it's going to generate more revenue. And so when making comparisons, financial comparisons, you got to adjust for that money. Which is why if you look at articles or textbooks that are doing it right, and they're talking about money, they'll always include like adjusted for inflation. So if they're comparing the 1980s to now, they'll note how much inflation has impacted it. Another example, the recording and reporting practices. Now one thing can make a big difference is how things are defined. And a good example of this is in the case of health-related issues. So, for example, take the concern with autism today. Now, are there more cases of autism today than in the past? Well, in a way we can't really say yes or no, because what we can say is there are more reported cases. So this is not accurate, but we've seen a significant increase in cases of autism. Similarly, we've also seen cases of diabetes increasing. Now, one question is, especially something complicated like autism, is to ask, do we have more cases, or are we finding more cases? So, I mean, the concept of autism has been around for a while, but has the definition broadened over the years? And the answer is, yeah. So now they have like a spectrum, so someone who, 10, 20 years ago wouldn't be classified as autistic, now would. So whenever we see a spike in something like autism or cancer or any health issue, it's important to ask, if you're making important decisions, is there more cases, or are we finding more? So schools, for example, now do far more tests on people. When I was a kid, they have broader definitions. When I was a kid, for example, when I was a kid, how many cases of attention deficit disorder were there? There were 0, because it wasn't a thing. People didn't use that, as far as I know, I didn't hear that term until much later. So it went from like 0 to lots. Isn't that kids have suddenly gone all crazy and stuff? No, it's just that, probably about the same number of cases, it just wasn't something that was recorded and reported. And so when we have, apparent, increases, it's important to ask, do we have more cases, or are more being reported? Similarly, as another example, we're doing comparisons. We have to make sure that things are recorded properly, the same way, and the definitions are the same. As one final example, consider poverty. Now, one way to reduce poverty is to do what? What's a way you could reduce poverty instantly? Just and then suddenly far fewer, or even no poor people. You could. Or you could redefine poverty. So if before being poor was, say, making, let's say, $12,000 a year or less for a family of 4, and you defined it as, say, poverty is making, say, $1,000 a year or less, we'd have way fewer poor people by the stats. But would that really help anybody? You tell people, you're not poor. No. So if when we're talking about the number of people, say, in poverty, then we'd have to look at what does that mean? And we don't use the same standard. If you go back through various administrations, you'll see the definition of poverty changes quite a bit. So a super easy way to get rid of poverty is just redefine it. There are no poor because poverty is defined, at an incredibly low level. So when we're comparing things, we want to make sure, are we using the same standard? If we're using like money, we want to make sure we adjust for inflation. If we're looking at cases of, a condition, a health issue, we want to make sure we're using the same standards, and we want to make sure that we're using the same amount of, say, investigation. Again, now in schools, people are tested for all kinds of, things, whereas in the past, not so much. And definitions, tend to broaden out. Like the definition of autism today is way broader than when I was a kid, and of course, that would result in more cases. So it's fair to ask, we do have more reported cases, but do we actually have more cases? And we might. We have to make sure we use the same definitions. Before pressing on, anything about this stuff that needs more stuff? Question 3. Are the items themselves comparable? So in this case, it's, are we using the same standards? And this is, are we actually taking things that are in fact comparable? For example, if we compare, say, consumer spending from year to year, but in one year there's like a big, some years back, I remember, it was under the Bush administration, everyone in America got like just like a, kind of like a bonus check or something. I was glad to get it. But of course, if we compare, well, when people get like a bonus unexpected check, what do they usually do with it? Yeah, you spend it, because you didn't plan on having it. Most people, spend it on stuff. And so in that year, consumer spending would go up. And then if we look in the next year, it would seem that consumer spending had dropped off. Now, it is true that it has dropped, but it's really not a fair comparison, because if you have, the government giving out like this rebate bonus check to people, and you compare that to now, not going to be really comparable. Another example, if you have, for example, if you compare the income in Boston after the Patriots win against, a few months from now, would that be comparable? If you suppose there's a business there, what's the business income going to look like in Boston a few months from now compared to like right after the Super Bowl?
Yeah, like a lot smaller.
Yeah, it's going to drop off. Similarly, if you have like any big event in a city, it's going to go up. So, there was a massive drop, but you have to make sure it's comparable. You should be worried if you're the mayor of a city, if your businesses are just dropping for no apparent reason. But if you have like a big festival or event and it goes up, and the next month it drops down, that really isn't comparable, because you have something that makes an important difference. So we want to make sure if we're comparing things, the things are actually comparable. There are other factors that make the comparison, apples to weasels as opposed to apples to apples. Now, as you might imagine, with these, all of these, but with these first three especially, sometimes people do this sort of accidentally. They're just being, not super careful. In which case, if it was important enough, what you do is have to kind of do your own research, because they didn't do it for you. In some cases, people do this, with sinister reasons. They're trying to deceive people. So, for example, if someone wants to argue that minimum wage should not be increased, they would point out, as I've heard people argue this, that when I was a boy pushing a lawnmower, it was $3.25. Today it's $15. Minimum wage is just fine. But of course, again, as we saw, $15 today might not buy what $3 did back then. So even though someone is getting more actual dollars, they're actually getting less buying power. And what matters is not how many dollars you have, it's how much that those dollars can get you. Before going on to question 4, anything about 1 through 3, or stories from the past? Because I know people love stories from the past. Question 4. Is the comparison expressed as an average? Now, if you've done like statistics, you've seen like averages and all the neat calculations, etc. We'll just focus on kind of the basics of averages. And if you want to see more about averages, a stats class is a good place to get all that stuff, or stats book. Now, we normally think of an average. If someone says average, we think of calculating it in the following way, which is the first version, what's called the mean. And with a mean, you take all the numbers in the set that you're going to average, and you divide that, you add them all up, and then divide that by the total number of numbers in the set. And that's our typical, if someone says, what's the average, that's what we think of. It's the average. So, what do we need to know about the mean? And one thing is we need to know is, it's not the only average. There's also the median and the mode. So kind of first thing is that when you get an average, one question is, what type is it? Is it mean, median, or mode? And even though they're all averages, they're different ways of averaging, and depending on the circumstances, they may all be different. It could all be the same, but they all be different. First thing to consider is, and this will be true of pretty much all of these, is that you can have an average with very different numbers in it. So for example, if we have, say, 10 and and 6, the average, of course, is we add them together, 16, divide by the number, so the average would be 8. Or if we had, say, 15 and 1, the average would also be 8. Now, a good question would be is why does it matter that you could have same average, very different sets of numbers? Well, where it would matter, to give a concrete example, would be if you're looking at something like economics and income, or housing costs. So if you're looking at, say, the average income in the United States, and it's expressed as the mean, well, if the average income is, say, $25,000, well, that tells you if you take all the income in the U.S., add it up, divide by the number of salaries, but it could be widely diverse. You could have some people, as you know, making tons and tons of money, a lot of people making very, very little. And so the average does give you an important number, but if we just say, oh, the average is like 25,000, well, that's good, that's above poverty, people are doing great. But you also need to know the actual kind of raw data, because again, you can have the very same average with very different distributions. And one way to illustrate this non-economically is think about, pizza slices. If you have, pizza with 8 slices, and you've got, dividing up among, 2 people, you could have a lot of different divisions. One could be one person gets 8, they get all the pizza, and one person gets 0. You could have a case where they each get 4, or 2 and 6, or any other division. And so if you think about it in terms of pizza slices, you get the same average pizza distribution, but in one case, the other person gets all the pizza, and you get no pizza. Another case, you get all the pizza, and you get to eat the box. Or you get half and half. And so, depending on how the numbers really are, you can get the same average for very, very different circumstances. So if you're looking at things like average income, average rainfall, etc., you want to ask, is this a mean? And then if it's important enough, you want to look at the actual numbers. Because you can make something good look bad, by using an average, or make something bad look good by using an average. So what are examples where this would impact, like, you? Well, give a couple of concrete examples. One would be when you're going out to pick a major and then get a job. And one thing, of course, you look at would be the average salary in your field. But does the average salary tell you what you're going to make? So could you be 100% sure if the average salary for, say, engineering majors is this, that's going to be your paycheck? No, it could be there are some engineers who make tons of money and some who don't make much. And to use kind of an extreme example, think of like acting. Suppose you're in theater, you're going to be an actor. Is the average income for actors possibly pretty good?
For average?
The average income.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you throw in, how much does like Leonardo DiCaprio get per movie? Or John Travolta, or that Tom Cruise guy. What was it, like 20 bucks? No, besides for movies, most of the budget is the star. They might get millions upon millions of dollars. So if you take, there's a few actors, Clooney, Jolie, etc., and then they make millions per film. So if you throw those in, the average salary for actors may actually look pretty good, because you have a few actors making, tons of money. But if, for the typical person going into it, are they gonna make like that kind of money? No, they probably won't even make the average, because people like the superstars who make millions pull off the average quite a bit. Another example is with books. When Amazon and other companies started making it so anybody can do this. You want to be an author, make money, crank out a book, go onto like Amazon or Apple or Barnes & Noble, create the book through their program, put it up, and as it sells, the money just goes into your bank account. Now, is being an author, a good career? Well, the average may be pretty good, because if you're someone like J.K. Rowling, you probably make really good money. So you have these multi-million-dollar authors, but what do most people make? Yeah, not a lot. So the average may be, in some professions, if you look at things like acting or YouTube. Like I've heard people say, I'm gonna make, I've heard these YouTubers make millions of dollars, which is true. And the average for YouTubers could be pretty good, because you have those people who are bringing in millions. But for the most part, no. So when it comes to like looking at what you're gonna make in something, you'd want more than just the average, because the average could look pretty good, but the question would be, what are most people, or what am I probably gonna get? Another example, when you graduate and you're picking some place to live, and you get a choice of like where to go, often today your choice is job or no job, but you want to look at things like average cost of housing, or like the weather, average rainfall, average temperature. But the averages can be quite misleading. So the average price of housing in an area, there may be, that's, what the houses typically are, affordable, or maybe there's some, like some neighborhoods or some areas, super expensive, super cheap, really awful stuff and really, super expensive stuff, and maybe not much in between. Or another place maybe more balanced. Or as an example, take weather. You can have two places that are the same average temperature, but they could be very different experiences. So one place could be like, 70 year-round or 60 year-round. Another place could have wildly varying temperatures, but it averages out the same. So when you're looking at average things like salary, cost of housing, weather, amount of rain, temperature, etc., you want to look beyond just what is the average to what is it usually like there. So question one, if it matters, is if it's the mean, you want to consider that. Is it a mean, and what are the actual numbers? Second type of average, the median. The median is the number in the middle of all the numbers, once they're put in numerical order. So instead of doing like a division thing, you just gotta find the one in the middle. And it's an average, but of course it's gonna be a different type of average. Now, in kind of an ideal situation, in what's called a bell curve, your mean, median, and mode would all be the same. Kind of like in grading. The perfect, at least in theory, the perfect grade curve would be exactly like that. The mode, would be dead in the center for all of them. So what's the median? Well, again, the median is, in a set of numbers, the one in the middle. Like this. That would be your median. Now, of course, in bigger numbers, bigger sets, you'd be a little more complicated, but that's the idea. Now, you can end up with number sets that are very, very different, but have exactly the same median. And this one will be a little bit silly. When people do real stats, they would adjust for this, but this is just an exaggeration to illustrate. You could have 1, 2, and 5,000. And in this case, the median is 2, because you've got 3 numbers, and 5,000, yeah, it's really huge, and 1 is really small, but 2's, that's one in the middle. Now again, when you're doing real stats, you do like some mathy stuff, but these two groups have the same median. So the same sort of warning that we saw about the mean applies. If you're told or find out the median of something, and you don't have the actual set of numbers, they can be very, very different. So they talk about the median income, or median temperature, or other numbers, unless you know that it's been, unless you can actually see kind of the raw data, they could be quite misleading. So again, like we go with like the salary, they say the median salary is this, then you could have very, very different sets of numbers with the exact same median. Same for like temperature, rainfall, cost of housing, etc. So kind of the question to ask in both these cases is, what type of average is it, and what are the actual numbers? Now one thing that does help is if you can get like the 3 types of averages, that kind of helps you get a better picture. But ideally, of course, you'd want to get like the raw data to see like what are the numbers. Last average is the mode. Unfortunately not like pie a la mode, it's not ice cream, sadly, but it means this. It's the number that occurs the most. And as you might imagine, as we've seen so far, same thing applies. You could have 2 sets of numbers which have the same mode but are quite different. So if we have 1, 2, 2, 3, 2 is the mode because it occurs twice. If you have 1, 2, 2, 5,000, 2 is still the mode because it occurs twice. So just like with a mean and a median, you could have radically different sets of numbers, same exact mode. So the same sort of concerns apply. So if you are looking at, say, going to a field, looking at salaries, for example, or you're looking to buy a house in an area to graduate, the average price, or rainfall, or anything that gets statistics to it, if you know it's the mode, you'd know it's the most frequent, that occurs the most, but it doesn't answer the question like, okay, this is the mode salary, what am I gonna make? Or that's the mode temperature, but what's the weather, the climate like there? And so in all these cases, you want to ask, what type of average is it? And then more particular questions. And again, to use a concrete example, if you're looking into, you're picking a major, and you're looking at the average salary, you want to ask, what type of average is this? Is it a mean, median, and mode? And you'd want to get, before, like say, I'm going to build my whole life around that salary, you'd want to look and see what's going on there. Because as we saw, you could have a field which has, say, a high average income, but it may be kind of like acting or sports. Some people make a whole bunch, and most people don't make a lot. I mean, to use a less extreme example, think about being a lawyer. If we go by like TV and movies, etc., how much do lawyers make?
A lot.
Yeah, tons of money. But do they really? Typically. Like if you go into law school, can you expect to like be super rich? Typically no. Many lawyers, I mean, they make not terrible money, but in many cases, if you're like a public defender, I guess you do make terrible money. And so law doesn't pay as much as people often think. It's true, on the high end, if you're like a super corporate lawyer, handling all these lobbying and celebrity cases, you're making tons of money. But if you're like a public defender or someone just working, at a small firm, you're not going to make that kind of money. So you want to know not just like, okay, what's the average in the field, but what am I likely to make in these conditions? So again, if it's important enough to consider, you want to ask that question. Okay, so those are our 4 questions. If the comparisons matter, you want to ask, is information being left out? So for example, if you have like a graphic showing comparison between things, you want to look to see if is there a scale on that, or is it just putting out these images. Second, is the same standard of comparison being used, the same recording and reporting practices? As an example, if they're talking about money, you want to make sure it's adjusted for inflation. If they're talking about a health condition, you want to check to see, are they using the same definition consistently, or does it, has it expanded over the years? And of course, are the items actually comparable? Is there an important difference that would make them non-comparable? And lastly, the averages. Before pressing on our remaining minutes, anything about this that needs more study? computers are now 9 years old. In computer years, they're dead. It's still hanging in there. Proof surrogates are repetition and repetition. Now, these two techniques are quite useful in terms of getting people to believe stuff without actually having any evidence. Because again, one of the key features of rhetoric is you're making people feel a certain way, positive or negative, in the hopes that they'll believe a certain way. But kind of the hallmark of rhetoric is logically, it's not even a bad argument, because it's not even an argument. Again, to use an analogy, going back to the food analogy, the nutritional value of the food is like the logic part. And the flavoring, the non-calorie flavoring, non-nutritional flavoring that goes on it, is like the rhetoric. And so rhetoric is basically just like spices without any calories or nutritional value. It just makes it taste good or bad. Now the proof surrogate is this. A surrogate, we often hear the term, of course, like surrogate mother, but of course they actually are a real mother because they're doing all the stuff. But a surrogate is something or someone that stands in for something else. For example, if you follow politics, you'll often hear about the president sending a surrogate to go and speak for him, and it's someone who stands in or someone who stands in for something else. Now, in a proof surrogate, the idea is what someone is doing is they're suggesting or promising proof, evidence, or reasons without actually giving it. To use an analogy, essentially it's an IOU for proof. And what the person is doing is saying or suggesting there is proof without actually giving the proof. For example, someone might say, everyone knows that small classrooms improve, class, student productivity, and of course there's this book that says that. And that, of course, isn't really proof because you don't know what the book is, you don't know what the book says, you don't know if it's a credible book. Or someone says, as another example, experts say you should avoid too much sugar in your diet. Now that's not a proof, that's saying some expert says this. And so essentially the technique is to say that they say without actually providing any proof or evidence. And there are various variations of this, like everyone says this, or experts claim, or again the classic one is they say. So on the side of evil, how do you use a proof surrogate? Well, the idea basically is, it's a technique. It's kind of like, well, in the old Popeye cartoon, there's a character called Wimpy, and he would always offer, to pay someone Tuesday for a hamburger today. I don't know what he did on Tuesday. I guess he offered to pay someone the next Tuesday for the hamburger today. So it's kind of that deal. It's like basically, saying to someone, I'll pay you, tomorrow if you believe this today. So the technique is basically to try to convince your audience that you have proof, evidence, or authority without actually providing it. And again, the easiest way to do it is just use the ubiquitous they. They say, experts say, scientists say, doctors say. And again, since it's a proof surrogate, you don't need to cite anything or provide anything. You're just saying they say. Another example is to say something like, people are saying, or people are talking about this. And so it enables one to present the illusion of proof. But of course, again, the illusion of proof doesn't prove stuff. So on the side of evil, again, the idea is giving a proof for something. Kind of the non-evil is basically maybe you kind of vaguely remember hearing it, and you say you can't remember exactly, so you're just kind of saying it. The evil version is when someone actually knows better, but they're not only giving a proof surrogate, it's actually a lie, that what they're saying is not true, and in fact there's no expert that says that. So that's like for extra evil. Now, in normal conversation, of course, do we expect people to cite their sources? Now that would be weird. So as a practical matter, if you're just talking to someone, you know, conversationally, and they say, oh, you know, they say you shouldn't eat too much salt these days, it'd be kind of annoying to like fact check the person, you know, right there. It was just a normal conversation. So yeah, in everyday talk, we don't expect people to cite stuff. But if someone is, you know, actually trying to prove something, it is fair, if they're trying to prove it, to say, well, what's the source on that? Is that actually true? So on the side of good, when it matters, the defense is, one, where's the actual proof or evidence? Where is this coming from? And as always, the other, you know, fallback question is, but is that actually true? So, proof surrogate. Before going to repetition, anything about proof surrogate that needs more proof or surrogate? Now, one way to sort of enhance or augment the proof surrogate is to tie it into our next technique, repetition. Repetition is super useful and super simple, because to do repetition, what are you going to do?
Do it over and over.
Yeah, you just keep doing it. You know, so you just, you know, do it, say it again, keep saying it. Now this technique wasn't invented, but it was sort of refined by the Nazis. Their, you know, kind of minister of propaganda really knew this stuff. And interestingly, much of American advertising was built on the techniques developed by Nazis. Now, we'll see in the future that to say that it must be evil because the Nazis developed it would be what's called the genetic fallacy, but they developed techniques that are quite useful, that are still useful today. And one of the techniques, again, they didn't invent it, but they perfected it, was this repetition. So, in terms of the method, what do you do? Well, kind of step one is this. You want to simplify it, the point you're making. You want to make what we call today a talking point. So you don't make it too complex, because it's hard to repeat like really long, complicated things. So you gotta make it like a very, you know, a sentence ideally. Now, there's kind of a whole art to this. So you'd want to keep it simple, but you also want to make it so it conveys a message, and you also want to make it so that it's memorable, catchy, and it's got like an emotional impact. And as you might imagine, when people are using this to try to sell products, they spend a lot of time and money trying to develop the perfect talking point. And in the case of advertising, it's often those slogans that we all remember, because we hear them over and over and over again, all those commercial jingles, like Coke adds life, that type of thing. So if you're trying to get, you know, people to believe a point, again, the first thing is generating your talking point. You want to make it simple and short, but you got to pack in there what you're trying to convey. And ideally, you want to make it something memorable, and for like bonus points, you want to make it something people could like chant, like at a rally, for example. So it's got to be, you know, clear, concise, ideally distinct, memorable, and if it kind of rhymes, that can be handy as well. Like if you want peace and legislation, you can't have war and investigation, which is a pretty good talking point because it got some rhyming in there. Now, so step one is getting your talking point. Step two, the easy part is repeat. Now, this can be done just like in a single context or setting where it just gets repeated as often as possible. And if you ever heard interviews of politicians or surrogates who are on task, they'll say the same damn thing, just like over and over in a short interview. Just just sort of talking point. And at first it seems kind of weird, but they know what they're doing because they're using this technique. Also, if possible, you want to essentially have a large scope. In other words, you want not just like you say repeating it, you want to spread it around. So if you're doing like a concerted rhetorical campaign, you would make your point, you'd say it a lot, and you want other people saying it. So for example, again, if you follow politics, you'll hear, like say, Republicans or Democrats, once they get their talking points, you'll hear them all saying it, like different people, different shows, etc., but they're all saying the same talking points. So you want to get it out there. Now, if it's just you, if you're doing like your own kind of campaign, you'd have to be kind of your own one-person army. But fortunately today with social media, you can multiply your voice with Twitter, with YouTube, etc. And if you want to be like totally evil, you can make like Twitter bots, you know, create your own kind of fake YouTube channel, you know, fake accounts to really spread it out there. So once you get all this stuff going, your key talking points, repeat it over and over, and spread it far, how does it work? Well, here's the psychology behind it. With us, people, if we hear something the first time and we think it's kind of sketchy, do we believe it? Typically no, we say that's BS. But if we hear it like a second time, what happens? And we hear it from like another, you know, we hear it somewhere, someone else saying the same thing. Well, we start wondering, maybe that's, no, I can't be. Third time? Fourth, fifth, 1,000th time? Yet eventually, if we hear it enough, we feel like it's true. Now again, this provides zero evidence. And if you multiply 0 by 1,000, what do you get? You have 1,000 zeros. You get 0. So no matter how much it's repeated, you still have no reason. But weirdly, with this sort of like psychological math instead of math, if you hear it enough, people tend to believe it. Why is this? Well, maybe some sort of psychological speculation is this. If we hear a lot of people saying the same thing, then we tend to think that it's true, because generally people, this will sound maybe weird, but generally people are honest. So when you hear a lot of people saying something, they probably believe it. And so it was useful. Like if someone, you think it back like in the ancient days, if someone says, yeah, there's a lion over there, and everyone says, yeah, there's a big lion over there, good chance that it's true. So it relies on the fact that we tend, if we hear something a lot, we tend to think everyone can't be lying. But can everyone be lying? Yes, they can. So on the side of evil, that's a technique. Craft your talking point, repeat it, spread it, and eventually people will start believing it. And you really want, when you hear other people who aren't part of your, you know, propaganda saying it. And a good example of this from 2016 was, of course, build the wall. What does that prove? What's the argument? Nothing, it's just a phrase. But did it work? Yeah, he said it over and over, it spread, and people still say it today. It was incredibly effective, and it helped him get elected. And the Democrats are looking for their talking point. What do they have now? Sad. I think it's Medicare for all, I think is their kind of their talking point, one of their talking points now, but they kind of walk it back. Also advertising relies on this as well. Again, when you know, companies try to have the slogans, for example, Nike tells us to.
Just do it.
Yeah, just do it. We all know that, because we hear it so often. Does that prove that we should buy Nike? No, but it works well for them. A good slogan sells. We all know those slogans because we've heard them so much. So on the side of evil, that's a technique. So if anybody's going to advertising or politics, this is a core technique. So how do you defend against it? Well, the main defense again is always, it's a simple defense you can use for everything. Is that true? Like, I've heard this said over and over again, but is this true? And if you listen to it with a critical ear, it almost seems like absurd. For example, when there's a company that owns like all these TV stations, and they instructed their anchors to read essentially a prepared statement, and what comedians did, of course, was get copies of all that, and then put a whole bunch of them up in a video of them all talking, basically parodying the same thing. And so in a way, if you listen to it with a critical ear, it just sounds silly. It just people just emptily parodying the same the same words over and over, like they're robots or zombies or something. So if you look at it or listen to it critically, instead of being influenced by it, you'll see, aha, they're just saying the same thing over and over again. They're not thinking, they're not giving reasons. They're just parrots sitting there making the same noise over and over. It didn't prove anything the first time. It doesn't prove anything the thousandth time. They just sound, they sound kind of silly. So the main defense is, again, asking yourself, is this actually true? And that can work kind of well. Okay, so that's the technique of repetition. Super useful. Before pressing on, though, anything about that needs more stuff? Now, one technique that's been around for quite a while, but of course, like with all improvements in technology, it's gotten more and more powerful and effective, is of course persuading people through visual images, visual rhetoric. And of course, we have the classic saying that a picture paints, 1,000 words, which can be kind of true or kind of not. Now, images can be quite effective at making people feel. Now, as the authors point out, an image by itself is not a claim, an argument, or a statement. Now, someone might be clever, might say, well, what about a picture of a, statement? Well, that would just be, a statement. And of course, this is true. If you have a visual image or movie, the movie itself is not a claim. A picture of, say, a building exploding, or a person holding a bloody shoe, in and of itself is not a claim. It's just an image. Because a claim is a statement that is true or false. And you can make claims about images. You could say, that's a genuine image, or it's a picture of a shoe, but the picture itself is not a claim or an argument, which is true. Now, why is that important to know? Well, strictly speaking, in logic, a picture is not evidence in the sense of being part of an argument. Now, that can be kind of seemingly confusing because in court, can pictures be evidence? Yeah. But what they're actually doing is, it's kind of indirect, because the idea is that, in a way, yes, the picture is evidence, but in a way it's not just the picture, it's claims about the picture. Namely that the picture shows like a person, that the picture is accurate, etc. So, strictly speaking, in critical thinking, a photo or visual image would not be a claim itself, but you can make claims about that. You could say this is a real picture of the suspect doing the crime, therefore they're guilty. So the picture itself, in a way, is not the claim. You're using the picture to support, you're talking about claims about the picture. So long and short version of that is, yeah, pictures themselves aren't claims, but you can make claims about them. And we kind of shorthand it by saying, yeah, the picture is evidence. But strictly speaking, it's not a claim, it's something we make claims about. Now, as we all know, images can have very powerful effects on people's emotions. They can make people feel. Hey, words can too. I mean, if you think of like poetry, for example, or stirring speeches, but images tend to have much more powerful effect. So, as you might imagine, people make use of them as persuasive tools. Now, as I said before, with all forms of rhetoric, it would be foolish, unwise, if you have like a good argument to not take advantage of rhetoric. Again, going back to the analogy of food, if you're making dinner, yeah, the main thing is nutrition, but if you can make it taste good, make it taste good. Why have a nutritional but bland, boring dinner? Likewise, if you have a good argument, a good case, and you can use pictures and illustrations to provide emotional power to it, that's fine. The emotional power has no logical weight, but there's no sense in just not using those tools. Again, like with the food analogy, if you want people to eat the food, you got to also make it taste good. Now, our concern though is not with using photos and images, to augment argumentation, to maybe put an illustration to illustrate what we're talking about, but in using them to mislead and deceive. So how are they done? Well, one thing, of course, is taking images and deliberately manipulating them. Now, this goes back to the origins of photography. Now, today, we often talk about, digital manipulation, Photoshop. The technique of manipulating photos is as old as photography. Good examples of this would be, it actually ties into people's interest in the supernatural and the weird. There's a famous photo that was accepted by Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes, which show pictures of fairies, the sprites and pixies, little people with little wings. And he believed they were real. But I mean, if you look at the photo, they're pretty clearly just little paper cutouts stuck there. But it was an attempt at image manipulation. Also during the early 1900s, late 1800s, spiritualism and mediumism was a big thing. There were people who claimed to be able to speak to the spirits of the dead. We still have them today. And one of the things they would do is what's called spirit photography. And they would take pictures that seemingly showed like ghosts or ectoplasm. But of course those were all fakes. You could, even though they didn't Photoshop, you can actually do a lot with one of those images. There are ways to manipulate, physical photographs in the way they're developed, etc., various techniques to create fake images. So in a way, Photoshopping predates Photoshop. So again, if you get interested in like the supernatural and the history of fakery, that whole thing with mediums is all kinds of interesting photos and techniques. Now, jumping ahead to now, how effectively can we manipulate images today? Well, it's super easy. If you spend, say, 15 minutes learning how to use Photoshop and learning like the selection tool, you can create a not terrible image of anything, just by pasting, paste someone in besides like a celebrity, or paste yourself into a backdrop of Paris or Mount Everest or something. And if someone's got actual lot of skills, they can take images and create all kinds of fake stuff. So one concern is, and this does happen, and there are cases where people get caught, and, lose their jobs or get in trouble, where people do manipulate these images. Now, what's especially interesting today is what's called the deep fake. Anybody know what the deep fake is? One of the first ones demonstrated was with President Obama, with his permission. Well, here's what they can do. It's not quite ready for prime time, but if you ever played like a decent video game, they can do, or seen, animated movies, they can do animated faces that look, pretty realistic. And one thing they can do, of course, is take that sort of same technology and either put someone's face or appearance on someone else's body doing something, probably something scandalous, and then release that out onto the web to create like a potential scandal. Now again, the technology today is not that great, so people, not super basic, people can use it to see through it. Another one is where they have someone else, basically controlling like this digital avatar, where they could have an image that looks just like, say, President Obama or President Trump, and have, using voice, clips or synthesis, make it seem like they're saying or doing something they didn't do. So one of the sci-fi concerns for the future will be these fakes, where it seems like a real video of someone talking or doing things, but it's all computer generated. And so the challenge will be in the future, how do you tell what you're seeing on YouTube or the news? How do you know that's actually real? Now, with our own resources, really hard to do. Today we can kind of tell because it gets out of sync or seems like a little off, but they're working on it to the point where it'll be very hard to tell. Now, fortunately, on the side of good, there are people who do this professionally. Often they get paid to do this, but they do analysis that exposes things that are fake. But of course, here's the problem. Which flies faster, lies or truth? Well, lies always outdistances the truth. The truth is pretty slow. Now this happens, of course, today, even without like this capacity, the capacity for these, perfect fakes. A fake story will get out there, and there'll be like the truth, the correction, but the damage is usually already done. And part of this is we don't put a lot of emphasis on correction. So, for example, back when there were newspapers, were the corrections on the first page? Like, here's all the things we got wrong. Now, this used to be like a little correction box way back there. And so for various reasons, the lies generally are way faster than the truth. I think it's like saying like the lie is already around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. So one problem will be is if a fake image, a fake video gets out there doing like a lot of damage. I mean, for example, you can take something from what's happening in Virginia today. They could take an image of someone, photo of someone, and then touch it up so it looked like they were dressing up like a Klansman or something. Back when they weren't, back when they were young, manipulating those images. They get them out there, scandal goes, and then all this damage is done. And even if it turns out it was a fake, there's still a lot of damage. And there'll always be people who will say, oh, it's the claim that it's a fake is a lie, it's really real. And so one problem we'll see is this fake stuff pouring out there so quickly that it'll be very hard for people who are concerned about the truth to keep up with it. And so we'll have a hard time knowing what is true. And if we think it's hard now, it's going to become vastly harder in the future. So kind of the future of critical thinking will be, how do you know the images you're seeing, the videos you're seeing, are really real? And again, there are people who are doing this professionally to try to sort this out, but their resources are always far less than the liars. And again, trying to catch a lie is very difficult. It's hard to catch up with it. And if you do catch up with it, the lie still persists. And to use an analogy, it's kind of like the lie is like disease, that it's running around infecting everybody, and you're trying to stop the lie, the disease, but everyone else is already infected, so you have to go and cure everybody. So, pretty tough. Second thing, and we'll close with this, you can also mislead people using completely legitimate real images, but use misleading captions. A good old example of this was a few years back, making rounds on social media was a picture of a person holding a child's shoe covered in blood. And they claimed this was from, I believe, like a refugee camp. And of course, it was a powerful image. It's a photograph of someone holding a child's shoe covered in blood, and had a huge impact on people. Now, the image was real. The problem was, though, the image was from years before. It was from Israel, not from where it was claimed to be. So yeah, it really was a shoe that belonged to a child. There really was blood on it. The image is not fake, but the caption was incorrect. So they took a real image and then recaptioned it. Another example is when President Trump claimed to have seen footage of people in America celebrating 9/11, and and he cites to like a racist website, and its picture is not from the U.S. but somewhere else. And so yeah, it's a real image of people celebrating, but it's not in the U.S. It's not about 9/11. It's just an image that's been recaptured. And so until we get like perfect faking, you have to keep an eye, and still have to keep an eye out for images that are real that have been recaptured. Now, one thing that we can do with this is, fortunately, if it's real, you can look at sort of the history to it. And one thing you can kind of quickly check is, if it matters, is Google has that image search function. Not perfect, but whenever someone puts up a photo and they're making all these outrageous claims on Facebook or some other place, just click on and do a Google search and see, oh, where it really came from. And it can be a very real image if it's something like saying, Muslim Americans celebrating 9/11. And you click on it, it's like, no, they're celebrating the 4th of July. And this is, Americans who are Muslim celebrating 4th of July, not 9/11. And so you can often check on things that way. Okay, so we'll close there. So the basic idea is don't trust images. So have a good rest of the week, and I'll see you on the Thursday.